Good evening and welcome everybody. Welcome to the roundtable on the current events in Egypt and beyond, organized by the Department of International Relations and European Studies. I'm Matteo Fumagalli, the head of the IRES department. Before we get started, let me just briefly introduce the panelists of this evening's event. We have Professor John Shattuck, CEU's President and Rector, Professor Selim Deringil, who is Professor at Bogazici University, as well as a visiting professor here at the Nationalism Studies program. We have Professor Emil Akçali at the IRES department, Daniel Monterescu from the Sociology and Anthropology department, and Professor Julius Horvat, the head of economics, and we're fortunate enough to have somebody coming straight from the American University of Cairo, though you were slightly out of Egypt, Matteo Tokic. So the format is the following. Each panelist will have about 5 minutes or so to address a number of issues ranging from the nature of the protests, the identity. We'll ask them to disaggregate and unpack them, the uprising in terms of the groups that are behind them, the strategies, the forms of protest, the relationship with the regime, and we'll look at international political as well as financial implications. I suppose that this will take us about half an hour. Each panelist will have around 5 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to the discussion. So that will take us nicely to 7, I guess. Okay. Before we get started, in fact, let me leave the floor to CEU's President and Rector. Thank you.
Thank you. I think in the spirit of this panel, I will stay seated, which is not my normal mode, but I'm delighted to do that. This reminds me, and there are a few people in this room who are old enough to remember this, of the great teach-ins that went on in the 1960s and 70s in Europe and the United States about some of the great issues that were sweeping the world at that time, having to do with civil rights and democracy. And this was when universities would get together and there would be an open and free discussion of some of these issues. And I'm delighted that in some respects we can recreate that atmosphere here at CEU around topics that are obviously of great and immediate importance. As we all know, CEU was founded 20 years ago at a time of great transition in this region in which we have our roots. And it was a transition that in many ways shook the world, and the world was affected not only here and across Europe, but in many ways throughout the world, as these remarkable forces of integration that occurred in Europe and certainly here in Hungary, starting with the Berlin Wall. I think in many ways today we may be at another period of great transition. I say may because I think this is an early stage of trying to analyze what is happening. But certainly the great events in North Africa that we have all watched unfold over the last month resemble in some measure some of the events that we saw in this region at the time of CEU's birth 20 years ago. We know, I think, that the effects of what is happening will be profound, even if we don't know exactly what direction the events will take. And I think, again, referring to CEU, because I think in many respects we have become a laboratory for the study of open society and democracy and the principles of the rule of law and the kinds of issues that were aired at that time of transition in the 1989 to 91 period. And in many ways, Central Europe became a laboratory for the building of open societies. None of the experiments conducted in that laboratory were by any means perfect, and we see even today that there is a great debate and contest underway in this region, in this country, and beyond, and throughout the world, over what is the meaning of democracy and open society as we look at events, even before we get to the issues that we're going to be examining here today. So we are on the verge, I think, of another great transition. I think in many ways, using the experience of this region, the questions, at least initially, that we might ask ourselves, is this a transition similar to 1989 in Berlin? Or is it a transition similar to the tragedies that occurred in Prague in 1968 and in Budapest and Hungary in 1956? Is it possible that something entirely new could emerge which redefines the meaning of open society and the meaning of democracy in the context of the events that are unfolding? And what are the stakes? The stakes are very high, clearly. They're extremely high for Egyptians and Tunisians. They're high for millions of others throughout the Middle East. They're very high for governments in Europe and the United States, which have long backed stability in the Middle East at the expense of democracy and human rights. So the stakes are very, very high. And we're here to examine some of those stakes and then engage all of you in this discussion as the events unfold. I think it's particularly appropriate that our International Relations and European Studies Department, chaired ably by Matteo Fumagalli, has organized this panel. So let me turn back to Matteo to then turn to each of us for brief comments before we enter into this broader discussion.
Thanks, John, for these remarks. We start off with general historical context. Some background is always useful. There is never a tabula rasa, so I'll just leave it to Professor Selim Deringil from Bogazici University in Istanbul.
Yeah, I'm not sure I like the role of the house historian, but somebody has to do it, so here we go. First of all, Egypt has always been a very special case as far as the Turks or the Ottoman Empire is concerned. Egypt is a very special case because it was actually almost, well, in effect, a de facto independent state after 1839, after the Muhammad Ali uprising and nearly defeat of his sultan. Although he was technically only the governor of the Ottoman Sultan, he was in fact a de facto independent ruler. And indeed, his descendants became the so-called Egyptian royal family, going down to King Farouk, who was deposed by Nasser. Okay, so this is the special case. And among the Arab countries that became independent, or first mandates and then independent after the Ottoman collapse, Egypt always had a very special situation because Egypt was the only one among them, actually, which was actually colonized directly by the British. Of course, they didn't call it colony, they called it protectorate, but never mind, it's more or less the same thing. So, again, a very special situation. So, this rupture with the so-called metropolis, the mother country, at a very early age, and then later on, the finding of that Egypt and Turkey found themselves in opposite camps, more or less, during the Cold War, of course, had a very important part to do with this, because Nasser, as we know, was quite close or flirting with the Soviets, and Turkey was, for all its worth, a Cold War warrior during the Cold War. Right, now I'm going to drop my mantle as a historian and say a few things as someone who reads the papers and watches the BBC. There's a lot of talk about this Turkish model, and the plan is that these newly revolutionized whatever Arab countries will go down the Turkish road and become democratized, nice, democratic Islamic countries. Now, there's a lot of gloating going on back home meaning Turkey, and I'm not at all very happy with this. Why are these people supposed to be taking us as a model? Are we so great? Do we have no problems? Are we such a pristine case of, beautiful, modern, democratic rule? Hardly. But this is something that people's egos are flattered. But there are two models, actually. One is the Islamic-oriented democracy, all right? The AKP, the present Turkish Republic's government's model, the sort of what we call, what the Americans have called soft Islam, or moderate Islam, of course, is the other way to look at it. And the other one, of course, is what we seem to be, in fact, getting in Egypt right now, a transitional, in fact, military guaranteed democracy, so-called, right? The military always in the background, ready to intervene if people get just that bit too democratic, and that's the model we had in Turkey for 40, 50 years. So that's the second model, and I fear it seems at this point to be tending in that direction. And Prime Minister Erdogan recently, actually not so recently, very soon after the Tahrir Square events began, actually said very clearly that Mubarak should step down. He was the first Middle Eastern Middle Eastern ruler or politician to say so. And yesterday, the Egyptian ambassador to Ankara, who is in fact Mubarak's man, told him to mind his own business. So there we are. I think I'll stop there and leave the floor to my other colleagues, and maybe we can chat later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Selim. We now turn to your right, to MLH.
All right. Okay, I will be talking briefly about the composition of the protesters in Egypt. I would like to emphasize that what is going on, I would call it a more popular revolt today in Egypt, actually has its roots in the public sector workers' revolts and the other social movements that have already erupted in 2007 and 2008. And these were reactions against the economic liberalization in the country, the economic liberalization program that was initiated by the Mubarak's government in 2004. But these were these mass protests erupted outside of the formal political spectrum and also outside of the NGO practice. So that's why I guess that they were not given that much attention by the international community, especially by the European Union. But these things were going on since 2007, 2008. And there is a very interesting convergence, because what started as a kind of a workers' revolts at that time converge with the middle class youth, and it is very interesting, this middle class thing right now in Tunisia and Egypt, because both countries are actually main exporters of industrial goods in Africa, and this has created some kind of a genuine middle class in both Tunisia and in Egypt. And this middle class, especially the youth, are educated, but they also cannot, because of the economic crisis and because of stagnation of economy, they cannot find jobs. So they kind of converge, they kind of allied with the workers. And that's why many analysts actually identify what is going on, especially in Tunisia, as some kind of a bourgeois revolution. But what happened in 2008, there was a kind of mass revolt, a mass strike in Al-Mahala, which was an industrial town in Egypt. There was the youth, the young people formed a movement called the 6th of April, because the strike was going to take place on the 6th of April. And they were using the symbol of, the 6th of April movement was the symbol of this feast, which was also used by the Otpor in Serbia, by the Serbian young people, in order to throw Milosevic in 2000. And it is very interesting because the Otpor movement in Serbia formed a kind of an organization called Canvas to export actually lessons learned in Serbia and the methods to the would-be non-violent revolutions. And the lessons in Ukraine and Georgia took these examples, and this Otpor was in close cooperation with the 6th of April movement in Egypt. So it has its roots. I mean, none of these things just evolved right now, in Egypt. It has a kind of a history. But that, as I said, this was the outside of the formal political opposition spectrum. And then these strikes, the 6th of April movement representatives have been persecuted. I mean, they were put into prison, or their sites were hacked and all that. But lately, very recently, the WikiLeaks identified this group as something outside of the opposition. I mean, something maybe not that valuable, and maybe their democratic rights claims as being unrealistic. So this incited the group to launch for a much broader mass rally, and which was initiated especially by the female human activist Asma Mahfouz, and this brings in the female role in Egyptian protests, because Egypt actually has a strong and a proud history of female participation in mass rallies. And this also happened especially in Al-Mahalla strikes, that the rural women also participated to the strikes at the time. So after the young women, the middle class young people, the workers and women, we have the political Islamists, but they come much back. I mean, usually maybe the perception would be that the Islamists are going to make such kind of a revolt or revolution, but you see that actually they were way behind, which is also an important part of these revolts, political Islam, especially Muslim Brotherhood, and it has a lot of members, both female and male young people. So it is also on the street, a Muslim Brotherhood, but it is not the main, let's say, the factor, dimension of these revolts. I think I passed already these 5 minutes that were given to us, so we will continue about these things as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mel. Daniel.
Good evening. This is an important discussion and I'm very happy to take part. I would like to start with a personal comment. These are exciting times, and I say that not just as an anthropologist working in the Middle East, but also as an Israeli. I recently had a conversation with a Palestinian elderly friend of mine, and he was weeping as he watched the news. His word captured the historical moment. He said, "I've never thought I would live to see that day." What he was weeping about was not only the joy of the moment, but also the tragedy of his generation. The generation of Arab nationalists who witnessed the rise and fall of a secular national Arab world. Today I would like to argue very carefully that what we are witnessing today is a certain return of a new form of pan-Arabism. The Egyptian uprising is a moment of victory for democracy, which I believe could make possible a new form of politics, a politics of recognition, a politics of exposure, of truth. Anyone who is slightly familiar with the Egyptian society knows that it is not a revolutionary society. One Egyptian observer likened Egypt to a sleepy elephant, which is now awakened and cannot be stopped. I would like to organize my comments in five pairs of what can be called constitutive contradictions, which frame the ongoing drama. The first tension is between the apparent stability of the regimes versus the long-term unsustainability of the Arab regimes. These Arab regimes, supported by the US and the European Union and even Israel, are revealed today as a neo-authoritarian regime, highly unsustainable and ultimately unstable. The abrupt departure of Ben Ali, fearing the crowds, exemplified this instability and illegitimacy. The optic illusion of the uncertain state of the Arab state reveals an anomaly which should be taken into consideration even without engaging the terrible human rights abuse and uneven distribution of wealth and resources in the region. The second tension is between that of Western democracy versus the stereotype of Oriental despotism in the Middle East. Analyzing the present situation requires facing deep-seated Orientalist stereotypes about the nature of Islamic movements and Islamic societies. Dominated by the shadow of the Shia precedent in Iran or by the fragmented tribal Iraqi civil war, I would argue that Egypt is a different case altogether, with a different political Sunni tradition. Here the notion of the nation is far more stable. While we cannot predict the future events, it's clear that so far the collective mobilization is inclusive, making political claims that involve the Christian minority, the same minority that was repressed by Mubarak regime. The West here will probably have to come to terms with a political coalition which doesn't conform to the Western equation between secularism and stable democracy. Moreover, recently researchers have shown that Muslim Brotherhoods in Egypt have been not more than a functional opposition to the regime, with which it actually coexisted for 40 years. Today, the Muslim Brotherhood negotiates with the government, while the secular youth, the ones that are called the 6th of April, Shabab, reject negotiations. These are, of course, more radical youth. Egypt used the Muslim Brotherhood as a threat for 40 years to justify its acts, and now it uses the Muslim Brotherhood to dismantle the opposition. In the future, of course, the level of pragmatism of the movement remains to be seen. We can talk about different comparisons. Of course, Selim mentioned the Turkish model, but I would like to turn our attention to Tunisia, where the parallel of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Nahda, led by El-Ghannouchi, interestingly does not reject the specific family code, Tunisian family code, which is highly secularized, but rather accept it. And I think that we can hear also similar voices by Muslim Brotherhood members in Egypt calling to incorporate the Egyptian family law as part of the ijtihad rather than to reject it altogether. So it seems that the Muslim Brotherhoods all over the Middle East and especially in Egypt communicate with liberal models. It is not neither nor. I would like to argue that more than a threat of Islamic takeover, the big story here is the return of a certain form of Pan-Arabism, a new form of Pan-Arabism to be sure. The return of Nasser as an icon for the demonstrator, as opposed to the iconoclastic Mubarak, rather than the establishment of the Islamic Sharia state, is what's going on the streets of Cairo. 12 years ago, the slogan of the Islamic Brotherhood was El-Islamu al-Hal, the solution, Islam is the solution. Today there is a different mood, and national identity is far more flexible and thus can accommodate liberal practices. The third tension is between top-down and bottom-up mobilization and the role of the new media. Some commentators rightly emphasize the role of the new media and, of course, Al Jazeera, politically motivated and engaged. And indeed, I don't think we can imagine the revolt as it is today without the role of Al Jazeera. This media is also changing the way the struggle is framed. If the struggle in Egypt started with anonymous, faceless collective mobilization with a collective subject, today we see a personified form of action. Commemoration of specific martyrs like Yahya Zakaria Jazzar signifies a move from the collective subject to individual agency. The same goes for Mubarak. While before the main slogan, it still is, was Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam, the people wants the downfall of the regime. Today people are targeting Mubarak as a specific personified target. And it seems that the fall of Mubarak for many of the demonstrators is more important than the change of the regime. Strangely enough, Omar Slimani is acceptable. People say that he's Watani, he's a real nationalist, etc. So these processes form a mediascape of change, which should be interpreted not at the micro level or the macro level, the top down or bottom up, but at the scale of articulation between the two. The fourth tension is the one between center and periphery, between urban and rural. It is telling that on the macro level, the domino effect, what came to be called the domino effect, has started not at the center of the Arab world in Egypt, but rather at the periphery with Tunisia, itself an illusion of stability and relative economic success until recently. While on the micro level, in Egypt itself and in Tunisia itself, it moved from the urban center to the rural periphery. A question that begs an answer is why does it happen in cities and not in villages? From another context, historical sociology has proposed the beginning of an answer. Cities arguably offer the massive co-presence of others. And capital megalopolis like Cairo is at the right scale between what Henri Lefebvre called the far order of the state and the near order of community. However, for this collective effervescence to be successful, to be an historical transformative event, it has to be framed differently in a way which rearticulates and transforms structures. We can think of the French Revolution rather than 1899, during which the success of the symbolic reframing of collective action changed it from local urban riot at the Bastille events to a claim for people's sovereignty. The framing in Egypt in terms of freedom, of civic rights, of distributive justice is precisely where the events in Egypt turn into transformations of action. Interesting slogans are the citizen images, the citizens versus the F-16, the importance of freedom, as for example here, right, Shabab Hor, the youth, the free youth, 30 years of constant injustice, the notion of state of emergency are all civic mobilizing concepts. If we mention the Bastille, it's interesting that in Cairo, the parallel of the Bastille was the taking of Abu Za'bal, of the same prison where many Palestinian inmates, Palestinian militants, were freed from and returned to Gaza afterwards. My fifth and last contradiction is between what we can call the counterfeit politics, between a politics of masking, a regime of as if, versus the politics of exposure or the politics of recognition. I will conclude with the implications of these events on Israel and Palestine. The implications of the changing political regime in Egypt and the entire Middle East will definitely have implications on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Many, if not most Israelis, fear this change. Normal citizens fear an Iran next door, and politicians voice their concern about the instability of the forthcoming regime. The incident with the gas pipe in Sinai on which Israel is dependent between Israel and Egypt is a good example. While this transformation will no doubt have major ramifications on the balance of power in the region, it will also force new coalitions. And these are not necessarily bad for the national interest of Israel in the long run and for the Palestinian cause. For example, Netanyahu recently talked about the revision of Israeli-Syrian relations in this respect. It is not normal that Egypt was criticizing Israel less than France or the Netherlands, right? Israel needs to take the Arab opinion a bit more seriously. One of the slogans of this movement, Rah Khof, the fear has gone, I think is turning into an important political engine. The hypocrisy that characterized the relations between citizen and ruler in the Arab world and regional politics in general can change. I believe we can learn from the American and Latin American experience. For decades, the US believed that it is the best way to dominate Latin America is through puppet authoritarian rulers. We can learn from the Latin American example that normalization is possible without puppet authoritarian or neo-authoritarian rulers. To conclude, I'm carefully optimistic. I believe that for the Arab world, and even for Israel, it can turn to be a welcome change. As only through the politics of recognition, sincerity, and exposure, we can deal with the real problems of the region, its real open wounds, education, social injustice, the occupation in Palestine. The political realistic engagement can eventually create a different Middle East, a new Middle East in the true sense of the word. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. We now turn to Matteo Tokic.
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank Matteo and actually also Dr. Tsemena Carrasco for the opportunity to come here, of course. I'm presently in something of exile. Getting back to Egypt is not the easiest thing and hasn't been for the last 2 weeks, but I will be going back on Thursday, actually the day after tomorrow, so perhaps you can invite me again. I'll have some more remarks at that point. The second thing also is I'm, in fact, also an historian. I'm not really accustomed to speaking about contemporary current events. But I would like to offer some cursory thoughts, speaking specifically to this youth generation, which I'm, as a professor at the American University in Cairo, so very closely in touch with, even presently, through all these various social media, which are being used and employed as a tool for this present actions. And I'd like to sort of just talk briefly about what it is about this generation, this present generation, which is in fact driving much of what is happening, or at least sort of beginning the process of having this happen, if not being the actual energy sustaining it. As was mentioned also, sort of one of the central components of Mubarak's legitimacy in Egypt these last 30 years was very much this fear of democracy, in the sense of fear of this idea that if there's not me, there's one alternative, and this is, of course, the Brotherhood. And since no one wants the brothers, obviously I can do what I want, and we maintain this sort of position in which we have this nice little balance where I stay in power, but no one really questions it too much. This is very much changed in this generation, and the question has become, what is it that is happening presently, which sees this younger generation believing, in fact, in the possibilities of democracy. And there are, I think, three important points to this, which I'll just, again, look at very briefly, and then we can discuss at another point. One thing that is, I think, very important about what's happening now is the movement is pointedly non-ideological and heterogeneous. I have an example of a flyer being spread around by what they call themselves the youth of Tahrir, and they say this in their opening paragraph. Firstly, again, I cite things as a historian, so please bear with me. Firstly, we are a group of Muslim and Christian Egyptians. The overwhelming majority of us do not belong to political parties and have no previous political activism. Our movement involves elderly and children, peasants, workers, professionals, students, and pensioners. Our movement cannot be classified as paid for or directed by a limited few because it attracted millions who responded to its emblem of removing the regime. Right? So the central point here clearly is this issue of the removal of the regime without any kind of statement of who we are sort of individually, who we are ideologically. And this is done very much on purpose and is very much sort of a central component to the way in which this movement is developing. A second issue, I think, which is not really getting discussed that much, but is, of course, the role of American involvement since 9/11 in the Middle East and the delegitimizing of the argument about political Islam. One reason that Mubarak, of course, was able to drive this fear of political Islam for such a long time, particularly the Brotherhood, was that it was very much seen as a real threat somehow. American involvement in Iraq and in Palestine, in Israel, Palestine, and the rest of the Middle East has in fact sort of shifted this notion of what political Islam can be about. And what it can be about, of course, is a tool of imperialists, colonialists, and autocrats to control populations. And this is very much being seen in this kind of new generation of educated youth who have grown up in the last 10 years of this idea of American imperialism controlling the Arab world through a fear of the Brotherhood, through a fear of political Islam, through a fear of Islamic revolution. And they reject it because, of course, they are, in many respects, rejecting this whole notion of what they see as American imperialism. And this is, of course, for them, then, a moment in which they can say, well, no, if this is a tool of American imperialism, we need to employ a new tool in which this is perhaps not the reality. In fact, democracy can mean something quite different, and an end to the regime can mean something quite different. The last point, the third point, also gets back to this issue of Egypt as a nationalist state. As Daniel referenced, Egypt has a very well-formed sense of nationalism. And ironically, perhaps, the events in Tunisia have very much driven what's happening today in Egypt, almost in the sense that the Egyptians themselves, the younger Egyptians, were embarrassed, I think is a good word to use, into revolution. What has happened at this point is Egypt, for a long time, imagined itself, and I think rightfully so, for much of its contemporary history, as the center of the Arab world, the center of Arab nationalism, the center of Arab media, of television, of music, of culture, of political life. This has been waning in recent years. The movement of the United States toward closer ties with Saudi Arabia being very important. The importance globally of Al Jazeera coming out of the Gulf states. Egypt, for many young Egyptians, and of course as the economy has begun to collapse as well, in many respects, has sort of removed Egypt from the center of the eyes of the Arab world. Tunisia was, for many Egyptians, a tipping point, right? No longer was, in fact, political change, political ideology coming from Egypt, in fact. In fact, there was some, in their view, again, irrelevant, secondary Arab state in North Africa that no one has even heard of or thought about, which suddenly becomes at the world stage, and hugely important for the possibilities of change in North Africa, in fact, the whole of the Arab world. And for many Egyptians, particularly young Egyptians, who have a very, I don't want to call it a nostalgia for the Nasser times, because of course, for many middle-class Egyptians, Nasser is highly problematic in terms of sort of the economic relationship they have with him. But of course, for this younger generation, which did not experience this and only look back at a time in which Egypt was a strong, powerful, important nation, they see the possibility of returning to this through their own activism as being sort of a central component of their own political activities at present. So I'll leave it again for these brief comments, and then maybe we can return to some of the ideas later on.
Thanks, Matteo. And now for a glance at the economic, financial component of the events, we turn to Julius Horvath.
Yes, so I would like to thank Matteo for organizing and Bella actually for having the idea to have such a session. So my talk, the short comments, might be summarized by a quotation from William Pfaff from the New York Review of Books. It says, even conventional reform backfires. So I will have 3 points to say. First is the kind of standard economic look at Egypt approximately October, November 2010. Not today, so this is based on the IMF documents and Financial Times and Wall Street Journal. Then look at some other issues which might be called economic, like unemployment, income inequality, transparency, corruption, and things, how these matter. And third, to some Middle Eastern geopolitical shocks. So first thing is, the regime of Tunisia, the Ben Ali, and President Mubarak in Egypt is typically considered in these documents like International Monetary Fund as a success. So IMF is fully praising Egypt in the report of 2010 October. Quote, it made significant progress in wide-ranging structural reforms that accelerated after 2004, as she mentioned, when the neoliberal or this process began. Mm-hmm. Data, just a quick summary. From 2004 to 2005, each year the growth is 4, 5, 7%. So it's a hugely the growth is mostly determined by total factor productivity, which is a buzzword we use for things which we don't know. Yeah, yeah. Which, but it typically is foreign-driven and much less employment with much less employment contribution. Inflation decreased. Used to be 20, 25, decreased in 2010 approximately to 13%, the so-called headline inflation, so the CPI inflation as we know it. IMF criticizes Egypt for having heavy social spendings. So the price of domestic fuel, petrol, and so is much more expensive in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and other countries because it's heavily subsidized from the Egyptian budget. Okay, so that's the first point. Yeah, so Egypt seems from 2004, especially under Minister of Finance Boutros Ghali or the nephew of the former. Yeah, so do this liberalization effort as is typically pushed by international financial community. Second, of course, you find in these reports other issues, and these issues, which of course are important and maybe more important than this conventional economic analysis. So first is, of course, that these growths need to have some effect. So World Bank estimates that during 2005-2008, approximately the upper poverty line decreased by 14%. But I don't know much about poverty anyway in Egypt, but so certain decrease they claim was happening. If you look at the World Bank 2010 Doing Business report, they improved their situation in this ranking. So it jumped 11 places. So it's now, I don't know, position 70 in the world. Transparency International, what concerns corruption, is 111 from 180. So that's the picture about Egypt. What, of course, might have importance, as it was already mentioned here, is the question of how the high growth transfers to employment. So if you just simply look on some points in this IMF report, you see that there were years of 4-5% growth, which led to small increase in unemployment. At the 7% growth, the unemployment decreased. That is true. Yeah. So why this matters and how this matters, it's is difficult. I don't know how to evaluate. It's true that the reports say that the educational reform was going on and the middle class was much strengthening, much more in Tunisia, but also in Egypt. Yeah. And what concerns I was in American University in Cairo, maybe 2005 or something, And the economics department, when you speak with the people, of course, once you felt the political situation, because when people began to speak about, I mean, classical economic stuff, but some kind of economic policy issues, they would a little bit decrease the voice. So that's what we did in 1985 in Prague or something, yeah? Yeah, we were kind of modern, liberal, but something might happen, so we decreased the voice. So I felt that clearly. So for the beginning, maybe it's enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Julius. And we now conclude with some remarks on the implications of the events for US foreign policy and the European Union, as well as the attitude of these two actors towards the events. So.
Thank you, Matteo. It's difficult to carry the entire US and EU on your back, but I will do my best. 5 minutes, I'm sure it can be done. And therefore, I must have 5 points, so I will do those quickly. First, let me, in the affirmative way, state what I think the opportunities are for both the United States and Europe. There's certainly an opportunity now, after a great deal of dissonance between rhetoric and reality, for Europe and the United States to demonstrate that they actually support the democratic change in the Middle East. And second, perhaps to even put some content behind what President Obama is calling the need for an orderly transition in Egypt behind what are undoubtedly going to be some new democratic or new regimes, if not democratic, elsewhere in the region. But I think in order to really understand how difficult those opportunities are to seize, we have to look at the second point, which is what are the pillars of US and European relations with the Middle East for the last 3 decades. The principal pillar has been, frankly, discounting democracy and human rights in the name of stability, and seeking various forms of stability. And I think I particularly agree, since 9/11, the efforts to shore up regimes that might be able to assist in staving off the possibilities of political Islam taking over. This was a political inheritance of President Obama, and it's one of the many areas of political inheritance that have been difficult for him to manage, but I think he has an opportunity here, perhaps similar to what he had in the context of the financial crisis. I think more concretely, the second pillar of US and EU relations has been this strategic real focus on, might perhaps even say obsession on the flow of oil and the efforts to assure that the access to oil fields and energy support throughout the world, but particularly in the United States and Europe, have been continued. And that, of course, is another one of the reasons why stability has been perhaps over any other consideration. There's also been a particular focus, especially in United States foreign policy, on the situation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and efforts to resolve that conflict. But I think those efforts have largely been top-down. They have not particularly engaged those forces that we are now seeing, particularly unleashed in Egypt, but perhaps elsewhere, where there's been a focus largely on government-to-government influence over the division of territory without necessarily a major focus on human rights. Moving to the third point, which is the elements of the US and EU relationship to Egypt in particular, because of course this is where the principal focus is today. Here I think for the last 3 decades, really since Sadat made his dramatic trip to Israel in 1979, there has been a real focus on making sure that Egypt retains strong relations with Israel. It is the only Arab country that recognizes Israel, and this has been a pillar of US-Egyptian relations. Sorry? Jordan, forgive me, you're right. You're right, I should have mentioned Jordan. Yes, exactly. There's been, in a sense, a price for this, which is annually the U.S. has provided $1.3 billion to Egypt in aid, which is also, of course, gone toward the elements of stability that I mentioned before, and has also created a relatively strong relationship, or at least a working relationship, between the U.S. and the Egyptian military. Which, of course, today is a particularly interesting relationship to watch as we see how events are going to unfold. So the fourth point I want to make is what is really at stake for the U.S. and the EU in the current developments, in addition to what are the opportunities, which I mentioned at the beginning, because I think those are real opportunities. But what's at stake certainly is Egyptian relations with Israel and the prospect of one of the principal pillars of the relative stability that the U.S. and EU have pursued in the region might be eliminated. There's also the Egyptian role that has been curried in many respects to slow the flow of weapons to radical Islamists. But I think even more at stake is the larger prize and the larger question of what is the U.S. and the EU relationship going to be with the next government of Egypt, whatever shape or form that government may take. And one hopes that the U.S. and EU are not simply banking on their relationship with the Egyptian military to shore up the prospects that government might come out right. Because if they do that in the wrong way and they send a new negative signal to the next government that they are not essentially backing the forces of change, that could in fact push the next government much more into the hands of political Islamists, and indeed from the perspective of the region toward Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, and indeed Al-Qaeda. So there are very high stakes, and therefore you see my fifth point is the high degree of ambiguity that you read every day in the press about the relations that the U.S. and the EU are trying to establish toward this unfolding drama that we've been discussing here tonight. On the one hand, they don't want to fall behind change and lose the possibility of influence and relationship with the possibly democratic leadership of the next government, or whatever the next government might be, but certainly not fall behind the forces of history that seem to be unfolding in the streets. And they also don't want to be seen to be taking the dictator's side against the people. So that is clearly on the one hand. On the other hand, and this is why you see a high degree of ambiguity, they don't want to scare those who are seen to be loyal allies, including, of course, Jordan, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, to say nothing of Israel itself, by seemingly pushing too far toward the forces of change that are at work today. So as a result, you have what I think Obama has called his promotion of an orderly transition, and the orderly transition reflects all the ambiguities that I just outlined. The big question, which I will leave us with before turning to the discussion, is whether the opportunity that I mentioned at the beginning can be seized, and whether the U.S. and the EU can be more than spectators in this drama that's unfolding, and might they indeed be able to assist in this orderly transition. And how would they do that? Well, one way is to look at history, as we've been doing in this discussion, and look at the history of something like the Marshall Plan that was undertaken in the late 1940s to rebuild Europe, and whether some of the very large amounts of funding that are now going to Egypt from the United States and less from the European Union might be redirected toward essentially rebuilding and assisting in rebuilding in ways that address fundamental issues of civil rights and human rights that for a long time have not been at the center of US and EU policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And in fact, let me thank all panelists for their insights. Well then, we've got a good 40 minutes for the discussion. I would be extremely grateful if you could introduce yourselves before posing the question, as well as being as concise as possible, so that we leave more time to as many speakers as possible. Michael, you will also see Bill moving here and there with the mic. So,
is this on? Yeah. First of all, thank you for all the different perspectives. The specter that's hovering over, say, some of the discussions of the revolution in Egypt, especially in Israel and America, I think, is the specter of Iran in 1979. And I'm wondering if, in particular, people that work on Islamic mobilization could talk a little bit about the distinction between Shia Iran and Sunni Egypt, and how this may have bearing on the unraveling or unfolding of events in the coming weeks, coming months, coming years. And just this very question of political Islam in a Iranian Shia context versus in an Egyptian Sunni context.
thank you. Shall we grab 3 questions at a time? So Jonas.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first row.
All right. All right, okay, sure.
Thank you. My name is Johannes Müller. I'm a PhD student in international relations. I would just like to address, and this is a general question to each of you, how you conceive of the discourse in Europe and in the US, from what I know, that has so far mainly portrayed the North African and Middle Eastern region as a region which would face many risks if political change happens, and with a negative outlook on the consequences of political change. I'm just not quite sure if I understand what the sponsors of this opinion are. Would you say these are just mostly Orientalist legacies that have led to such a negative outlook for this region, for change in this region as compared to other regions in the world? Or would you think there are specific actors, political interests behind this dominant idea of the region?
Thank you. Here with, here.
Thank you. Jean-Louis Fabiani, sociologist at CEU. And I would like to thank you for this beautiful panel. I think CEU is the right place to engage this type of discussion. And I would like to speak from 2 points of view. The first one is the social sciences. And it seems that listening to your short presentation, that the anthropology and sociology on the one hand and economic science have very different takes on the issue. And as a sociologist, I would be closer to what Daniel said. And as a French citizen also, I have a few questions. So I would like to know why I think the studies of by anthropologists and sociologists who could have been interesting in forecasting recent events are not really taken into account very seriously most of the time. And if we speak from the French point of view, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the very distinguished economist, and the boss of the IMF now, described very recently, less than 2 years ago, Tunisia as the best pupil in the classroom. And of course, sociologists could have a very different point of view on the situation in Tunisia. And we French people have 2 very interesting research centers, and I lecture in both, the IRMC in Tunis and the CEDEJ in Cairo. And recently, 3 days ago, the French Minister for Foreign Affairs, Madame Alliot-Marie, said that the researchers should keep silent in both countries regarding to the recent events. And this is, I think that there should be a sort of new equilibrium between the economic science and the social science in this respect. Because of course, the class conflicts and the middle class upsurge, I agree with you, that we have seen in these countries can be explained, I think, sociologically. So I think even in since the economic crisis, the finance crisis, we should also try to find a new balance between the social sciences, and that what Daniel said about the situation was very interesting in this respect.
Thank you. Daniel, do you want to respond to?
Perhaps I can start. Actually, there's a very interesting link between economics and sociology in this respect. And it is true that sociologists and anthropologists and historians are not taken very seriously. I think economists are taken seriously, sometimes with, let's say, ambivalent implications. But it is interesting that in the landscape of the Middle East, with Tunisia of an unemployment rate of over 30% and Egypt of an unemployment rate of over 30%, this is precisely where this happened, rather than Morocco or Jordan. The third place with an unemployment rate of more than 30% is Palestine. And indeed, recently, what we see is a form of a neo-authoritarian repression by the Palestinian Authority and, strangely enough, by Hamas itself, repressing solidarity rallies of Palestinians. So I think we have here kind of basically what is needed is a combination of an economic and a socio-historical analysis. Perhaps I'll give the others more.
This political Islam thing, I just want to say something. I think, I see a major difference between what happened in Iran and what's happening in Egypt and Tunisia and maybe in other parts of the Arab world that we can see. The political Islam was the main motor in Iranian revolution. This is not the case in Egypt, and this is not the case in Tunisia today. So we are seeing a different kind of, for mass revolt, as I said, for people are rallying for democratic and economic rights, but the political Islam, and I very much agree that there is no political leadership to this. I mean, there is no yet political leadership, which was not the case in the Iranian revolution. There was a very crucial, there was a very important political leadership there. There is something else also that separates Muslim Brotherhood, which is the political Islam element in these revolts. Muslim Brotherhood is actually very crucial in the development of political Islam in general in the region. Okay, Hamas is an offshoot of, for example, Muslim Brotherhood. And all the Islamists that you see in other countries, and in Malaysia, Pakistan, Turkey, they share actually the same core values and also the methodology, how to actually work in terms of charity work of Muslim Brotherhood. So it is actually the main source of the development of political Islam. But what I don't see also in this Shiite way of practicing Islam is this lack of charity work and going to the grassroots level, because this is how Muslim Brotherhood, the Sunni Islam, has developed as a political Islamist actor in the region. So these are the differences that I can say that differs. It doesn't mean that the Shiite Islamism does not have kind of a solidarity moment, because we see that, for example, between the Iranians and the Hezbollah and some other Shiites also the help, the solidarity between the Iranians and then the Shiite community in Iraq. But the way that the Muslim Brotherhood works, I think it is much more developed in terms of practice. To also develop itself, not only in Egypt, that where it was born, but also throughout the region.
Can I just add a point
Sure.
about economics? What Mubarak should have been told that it's the economy stupid, and it's amazing to look at the sphere of economy to track the short-sightedness of the regime. And like many other authoritarian or neo-authoritarian regime, these are the trivial or the mundane triggers that put forth revolutions, right? Just to give you a few numbers, recently we see the rise of 30 to 50% in local black and formal markets of fuel, flour, rice in Egypt. And we should remember that bread riots under Sadat broke out in 1977, basically in around the same time, winter, January 18, 1977, due to the rising prices of one piaster, one Egyptian piaster in bread prices. So these economic reasons, microeconomic reasons, are crucial, and it is amazing to see how they fail to understand what's going on under their nose. However, what marks the difference between these events and the bread riots of 1977 or the conscription riots in 1986 is precisely what marks these events and historical transformation, right? The fact that the demonstrators managed to frame the events in a civic, nationalist, mobilizing framework is what marks the importance, the historical importance of mundane economic triggers.
Selim, do you want to
Well, I thought
comment?
we were going.
Yeah, sure.
No,
go ahead.
I'll
No,
do
sure.
whatever I'm told.
Yeah.
I don't care. You know?
No, it's fine,
I don't understand at all.
Speak.
Regarding the difference between Sunni and Shiite Islam, Michael raised a very important point, and I really don't know if everyone is very clear on this. I mean, not only people in this room, but generally speaking. First of all, Shiite Islam has a very ancient tradition of oppositional politics. It goes right back to the 17th century, 16th century, when the mullahs could get people on the street like that. All right? And they had, and unlike Sunni ulama, they had an independent support base. They had their own tax base, they had their own networks. It was very, very different to the Sunni ulama. The Sunni ulama, even the most radical ones, ultimately, when push came to shove, remained a loyal opposition. You see, at least in the Ottoman experience. So that's the very, very important difference between the two. I mean, this is what even in Turkey, people, when they say, you know, is Egypt going to become another Iran? Well, I really do not think so. Another point is this, I'm hearing more and more of this political Islam. Does this mean simply the Islam we do not like? Because it's beginning to sound like that. You know, the Islam we like are these nice guys who wear coats and ties and, you know, whatever. The Islam we don't like are these guys who wear these funny tablecloths on their heads, you know, and they're political. Well, I hate to say this, but Islam was always political, right? Right, way back whenever. It was never a it began as a political movement. And the other thing, it was recently said, and I thought to myself, about time, but I no less a personage than this very interesting woman whose name unfortunately escapes me. She's a member of the cabinet in Britain, a Muslim woman, who said that this was very insulting to divide Islam into moderate and fundamentalist. And, you know, coming from Dame somebody other in the Islam, I wish I remembered the name. I'm terrible with names, unfortunately. I think this is an important consideration. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll make a very brief comment because I think it's important to get more questions. But just a reflection on the question about why such a negative attitude toward those who are participating in the protests, or why failure to understand the motivations. And I think there is a great deal of misunderstanding both in Europe and in the United States about the forces that are at work. And I think, again, I'd refer back as a moment, a watershed moment, to 9/11. I think 9/11 set average American and European opinion into a very negative mode with respect to Islam. Not just political Islam, but all of Islam in a certain way. And I think it's a very dangerous phenomenon. It was fueled by the fact that obviously there were those who were ascribing to Islamic principles who were involved directly in the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And then indeed other attacks that have occurred in Europe since. And so you have a kind of poisoning of the political environment about the subject of Islam. And I think that has unfortunately led to a fundamental misunderstanding of so many of the forces that we're talking about here today, until hopefully now, when there's an opportunity to see what those forces are, that they are people whose aspirations for democracy and change, and above all avoiding the repression of their governments and overturning that or changing that's a very common and worldwide phenomenon. And one would hope that that's why I started this seminar by referencing back to the events of 1989 here, which are more familiar in a sense to us and to the world. It's the same aspirations, but unfortunately there's been a poisoning of the political discourse about Islam since 9/11, which I think caused a fundamental misunderstanding of what was at work underneath it all in the region during this period.
Thanks, John.
My first reaction, of course, as an historian, is to say, well, particularly with this question of the economy, as time will tell us, in a sense. The thing about it, though, which I find most interesting is the way the actors themselves are perceiving the issue, perceiving the problem, and perceiving how these developments will unfold. And I think in this sense is part of the problem economically seen, and this was the point that was made earlier on, is the degree to which sort of middle-class, well-educated youth were the initiators of perhaps what is happening at this point, but whether or not they become the driving force, right? At what point sort of mobilization of different elements within Egyptian society, particularly but across the Middle East, can be pushed and moved in one way or the other, right? Does this become the bourgeois revolution of sort of disenchanted middle-class, well-educated people whose jobs are not quite as good as they expected? Or is this really then ultimately about the millions upon millions of people in Egypt who are living on $2 a day and are living in poverty, which, to be entirely honest, I fear is not necessarily being recognized by much of these middle-class youth, that there is this sense of solidarity with these greater masses, but without actually real understanding of what their needs are and what their desires are for New Egypt. This then, of course, becomes the point in which one says, well, yes, of course, the sort of traditional role that the brothers have played in handing out bread when there's been no bread, of community service, of their long-standing role in Egyptian society, in which they can then, of course, sort of utilize this and mobilize it in a particular kind of direction. And I think in this sense, of course, if we want to look at 79 in Iran, what's happening today, is the brothers, I mean, this is, I think, very clearly demonstrated, are sort of very smartly playing the waiting game for a particular kind of legitimacy. They understand very, very well that their time has potentially come, but that means at this point demonstrating a bit of patience, demonstrating sort of a particular kind of understanding that, in fact, the base is their base and not this middle-class base, not the base of the youth. And that if they can just sort of wait out in this moment in which democratic change comes and they enter into the system not as a revolutionary force, but as a democratic force, which of course legitimizes them in this particular kind of way, right? This is how they get into power. Now, getting back to this question, is this problematic? I personally would suggest that perhaps is problematic. I think, when we look at sort of, in some respects, the political agenda, I think, this question of political Islam as sort of after 9/11 has been chastised, all these other kinds of things. But it's something that there is a very real fear of it within Egyptian society, particularly middle class and upper class Egyptian society. There is this sort of belief that the Brotherhood means an end to the possibilities of modernization in the traditional Western sense, true democracy in the French model, whatever other kinds of things. And this could eventually come to a head, but too late, because of course democracy is not about the end result, but about the process. And the brothers understand this, and they say, well, if we are part of the process and also the end result, right? Who needs the revolution? And I think this is the role they're playing, and this is then, of course, the role that the economy will also ultimately play into this. Where that presently stands, you know, maybe you can tell us.
Leave it to the economy.
This was a brilliant one. Yeah. So, you know, so that is true. There is this tension between sociology and economics traditionally, and also economics and ethics and other disciplines. That is absolutely correct. This tension exists. The forecasting ability of social sciences generally is low. So we didn't see the fall of Soviet Union compared to the Tunisian, revolution is something. Yeah, and much bigger. So that is true, and that is interesting how the data seem completely different. Our colleague speaks about 30% unemployment, and I guess it might be correct in certain neighborhoods where you have this underemployed population, especially of the young. But generally, Egyptian unemployment is like US. It's around 9%. By the statistics as it is done by the IMF researchers, and they have this, they check the similar way of calculation. They have a department for that. So these are all tensions which we feel. Yeah.
Thank you. We can take another round of questions. Okay, so we can start from there and move leftwards. From the last row. Yeah.
My name is Piotr Ciclik. I'm a PhD candidate at the history department. There's been much going on about this, the concept of transition and how Central and Eastern European experience might help. And I would like to follow Professor Deringil while asking his question: are we really that in a position to offer help? And in order to do that, I would kind of reverse the question. I mean, the Hungarian context is, of course, at issue, but I would reverse the question and try to ask whether we were the Egyptians in '89. And I just think that for the Western public opinion, it was, if you substitute the religious fundamentalism for nationalism, populism, anti-Semitism, post-totalitarian mentality, and whatever, we were sort of this, threat to international stability. And with this, it's connected this concept of orderly transition, which the American administration is forcing. And this way of making transition, just supposing that the old regime elite is kind of more of a stable partner, that the emerging democratic forces has been one of the biggest liabilities during this 20 years, and it actually did not take the populism away, but rather fueled it even more. So my question is whether this concept of orderly transition is totally okay. And the second question is that what stabilized Central and Eastern Europe, at least the huge part of it, was the perspective of the EU accession and NATO accession. I mean, among the huge cleavages between the old and the new elites, this was kind of a stable value consensus about where we want to go. When you take this away, you have what happens here or what happened in Poland a couple of years ago. So the question is whether there is an equivalent in the Arab world that might stabilize those future cleavages.
Thank you. Can you just pass the microphone to your right? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Omina. I'm from the Public Policy Department, and my question is about the fact that Egypt had been in a state of emergency since 1981, and we are mentioning the economic factors and the social factors, but I think we are missing the crucial fact that Egyptian people and the youths that we are referring to have been living in a state of emergency without the freedom of expression and the basic human rights and the principles of democracy. And I was just wondering if we will be touching upon that, given the fact that President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and the other Western diplomats and politicians have been calling upon the Middle East to democratize themselves. And now, after all of the calls, we have this uprising in Egypt, and Egypt is a strategic country in the Middle East, and I feel like that we are undermining the process while we should be supporting it.
Thank you.
My name is Rania, and I'm from Egypt, and I just came back from Cairo yesterday night, and I just wanted to say some comments. The first comment, everyone is referring to Tahrir Square like as if like everything is just happening there. Although that demonstration is taking place all over Egypt. In every city of Egypt there is demonstration. BBC reported that there were more than 8 million people last Tuesday, and I think it's underestimated. It's even more than this. In Alexandria there was a video on Facebook that it was running for 10 minutes, and it was just showing floods of people coming, and it didn't start and it didn't end. It just stopped, and the people were still running. And I think it's meant to be. The media is focusing only on Tahrir Square and in Cairo. So if they dismantle this crowd, they mean they aborted the revolution. And I don't know. I hope it's working, because lots of people now outside Cairo, they come to Cairo to demonstrate because no one is paying any attention to them. There is no media coverage. We don't know anything happening there, although there is so many demonstrations all over Egypt. This is something. I hope it changes. Something else regarding the economic indicators and stuff. In Egypt, there is no transparency at all, and like data are totally cooked. You can never trust any data coming from Egypt. It never, because like who make the data, who like, come out of the reports are Egyptian experts, having close ties with the government, and they can never disseminate any reports without the approval of the government. So it's always the government that like, okay, unemployment rate is 9%, although it's more than 30, or no one knows how much it is. And even if the trends are saying that we're having economic growth, but still it's only rich people getting richer, and the inequality is getting bigger, and the middle class is shrinking. And even if it's growing, but it's only in the hand of some rich people, and it never reached the poor. This is something else. A third comment I wanted to comment in is when you mentioned about the charity of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's actually not only the Muslim Brotherhood that are crazily doing charity, it's all Egyptian. I've been in the square for the last 12 days, and we just lived on donations of everyone. Everyone is just bringing in food and medicine and water and blankets and everything. And it wasn't only the Muslim Brotherhood, even the Christians in Egypt are crazy in charity. The Christian every month, like charity and solidarity is what made us survive for the last 30 years. The Christians in Egypt, they have this thing that they pay 10% of their income every month for charity. And the Muslims as well. So it's not only a matter of Muslim Brotherhood, it's like an Egyptian thing, and that's what kept us surviving so far. And in the square, like everyone is like, who cannot get to Tahrir Square, they can just send lots of donations. So I just wanted to say something. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for sharing this. Okay, shall we take a couple of extra questions? Bill? Can we take a question from there and one from this side here?
Hello, thank you very much for such an interesting panel. And I have a question for our dear Rector and President, John Shattuck. You ask if the US and the European Union can be more involved or something more than spectators in health transition. And I can keep in mind that for hegemonic powers, it's not always easy not to be active. But wouldn't be the best way to contribute to take some distance and not try to interfere? Because I'm not sure if participation of foreign powers tends to reinforce like the moderate forces within these processes, I'm not sure about the Marshall Plan. The conflict was already over. And if I want to imagine a similar situation in Mexico, where I'm not been in Egypt, but certainly foreign intervention would not help for a peaceful solution or transition toward more freedom. So basically my question isn't it the best way of helping this process to step out from it until the Egyptians figure out by themselves? Thank you.
Thanks. Let me take one more question before we get back to the very top.
Thank you for your nice comments. My name is Dadway from Political Science Department, MA student. The case of Iran came up a couple of times. I just wanted to make a comment. I think this is a great opportunity to see again that the regional politics become of high importance. Of course, this region has many things in common, right, like religion and the waking up of the sound for freedom. But on the other hand, there are many differences. I believe that the case of Egypt or Tunisia or Iran are highly different. For example, I would disagree with you, lady, sorry I don't know your name, that exactly it was the opposite. That in Iran, the movement was started not really politically, Islamistically oriented, and there was a lack of opposition and leadership in Iran, and there was more fear and suppression. Even people were just seeking to find a chance to express their voice by supporting the opposition candidate. But in Egypt, as far as my knowledge limit let me know, is that Egyptian army is a kind of like playing an independent role. But in the case of Iran, we don't have actually an army, and the Revolutionary Guard is highly supporting the regime itself. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I suppose it was Professor actually you were referring to. Okay. I would probably get back to the panel. I know that. Oh, sorry. Okay. Doro.
A very short question. Can you tell a little bit about the organizations that might or might not be behind, other than, I mean, you told about who are the forces, but not how organized are they really, on which level, what type of leadership? So is there any group that could eventually take over more than a marginal group, so that there is no vacuum basically appearing apart from the army, the Muslim Brotherhood, or the current rulers? Thank you.
Maybe somebody knew the answer to this question because it's so vague now. I mean, there is no such leadership or who's going to.
Yeah. Can you pass the microphone?
I was going to say something else, but I mean, the organization behind it's so everything. I mean, with the 6th of April movement, all this rally, I mean, calling to the streets and all that started at the social media framework, with this Facebook, with the internet sites, and I said there's this kind of the transitional or transnational kind of youth movement. I mean, going from Serbia to Ukraine to Georgia, and then affecting also the youth movements in North Africa now through the social media tools. So who's going to take over? It's such a big question, and I don't think even the Egyptians know this question themselves at the moment, or who is organizing, who is the main force organizing all these groups. The only one that maybe why we focus so much on political Islam is that because that's the only group, the political leadership that we know so well. I mean, because that is there, and it's been within the oppositional. I mean, it's not been legalized, but it is within the main oppositional spectrum, and that's why everybody is focusing on Muslim Brotherhood. But on the other side, these are non-traditional oppositional groups who have come at the moment. And this is very interesting because these are all political subjectivities that are being formed, and these are all maybe need to be analyzed in their own right at the moment. And this is why maybe the European Union so far, in its democracy promotion in the region, have not given enough attention to these groups. There is also one more thing that I want to link this with. It is very interesting also with Eastern European case that right now we are seeing a kind of a movement that also resonates with global discourses, human rights, democracy, and that also develop through these social media tools, that are also some kind of resonating with global discourses. But as I said, the roots of all these revolts date back to 2004, 2008, 2007. And these were very traditional protests. These were traditional of the workers, because they were against, these were public sector workers. And then these were the rural people were also protesting. And these are very traditional. And just please note that they haven't taken this much attention at that time in the Al-Mahala, in that industrial town. And they didn't, maybe we heard or we didn't really, European Union did not care about it. And it is very interesting because then we need to ask each other, ourselves this question, is the European Union, okay, it is interested in democracy promotion, but is it really interesting in democratic ethos? Because this has been going on since 2007, 2008. And right now it's also been going on, but it becomes so much interesting because it is a kind of a global level. We are hearing it more through media, and it is interesting because all this youth movement happened also in some other places, and we call it revolution. This is also, we call the Orange Revolution, and we call also what's going on in Egypt the revolution. Right now that it is kind of maybe kind of more sympathetic to our own eyes. Because of the way it has developed as itself as well. So I think this is very crucial in that sense. And I think it was also the charity work. Now I'm going to also link it with this charity, because the charity in Muslim countries, what's going on in Turkey, we can say that what was going on in Turkey, it was kind of the same thing in Egypt and maybe in Tunisia. And as you have said that the society worked on charity, this shows that, this shows the lack of something in these countries that the charity has replaced. This is the lack of social welfare state, okay? And this is very much in hand with the neoliberal globalization. That's why you also see in a very neoliberal state, like for example the United States and United Kingdom, this charity work as well, because they're replacing something that the welfare state is shrinking, it doesn't exist, so they are replacing something. In this case, that we also need to ask each other, ourselves the question that maybe if we compare it with Eastern Europe right now, instead of imagining a solution for liberal democracy or Western liberalism, maybe these countries right now, maybe in the past also Eastern Europe countries, but maybe in North Africa, in Middle East, the Arabic countries need something else, and which needs to be more based on a kind of a social state. This is all I wanted to say.
Thank you. I would probably leave it to the individual panelists to either respond or comment. Daniel, yeah.
If I may address the three questions, the comments made about Iran and connected to Michael's question about the difference between Shia and Sunna, and the question here about Orientalism. Let me start by saying that Iran is deeply misunderstood, and it seems that gradually Egypt and the Islamic movement is becoming misunderstood as well. I would refrain. Your question is very problematic, and even though myself, when I teach about the difference, we talk about the Shia style of eschatology and oppositional tradition and Sunni rigidity, etc. When it comes to actual explanations, there is a series of a trap of teleology here, right? When we look back at the Islamic Revolution, we suddenly recognize patterns which fit very well with our Orientalist images, right, of what Shia politics is. However, as our colleague here mentioned, the revolution didn't start as an Islamic revolution. And it didn't develop into a theocracy just out of the doctrinal and Orientalist principles, right? The same goes for the Sunni Middle East. People explain Sunni principles as causes for example, Saudi Arabia. Right, the rigidity of the specific regime in Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. These are very tricky and muddy muddy grounds, and I would refer from talking about all these. The very principles that we now identify as the ideological or cultural reasons for the Iranian theocracy were used for the period of the Shah to explain the exceptionalism, right? The Iranian exceptionalism. And one day, once and if the Iranian regime falls, then again we will invoke the oppositional culture and the dynamic Shia traditions. In some, I would avoid looking at these doctrinal variables as important, and rather look at specific moments of articulations and how these are mobilized by the people, and they can be mobilized from Salafi jihad to pragmatic liberal Islamic movements.
Thank you.
There's no point discussing it. We'll never agree, so there's no point in boring.
It's a good reason to discuss.
Let me just make two quick comments in response to two questions. One from the gentleman up here regarding the question of whether there's some analogy or maybe it's inappropriate, he said, to even think of an analogy between the transition in Central Europe and the transition that might be underway in the Middle East. And let me just say that both the other question that I want to look at is Rodrigo's question regarding, is it a good idea for U.S. and EU even to be involved at all in this situation? And just to tell you that my comments that I made to you earlier, which I think are fairly evident, I made as an analyst, not as a policymaker. I wanted to make sure that you had my analysis, and it's fairly well informed because I know reasonably well how the policymakers think. But I'm now very pleased to be the president and rector of CEU rather than a policymaker either in the US or in the EU. So what I think I described to you is a fairly accurate presentation of where the policymakers are and the conundrum they face. Now, having said that, first in answer to the question of whether there's a parallel between the two, I think the real question, the underlying question in the context of what's happening in Egypt is whether something very different might emerge from any model that we know, and indeed something that's different from the liberal democratic model that was the model that was the, for better or for worse, the model that was used in this region. I think there are many questions that have been raised on the panel as to whether something quite different could emerge, ranging from something quite remarkable and good, which is an expression of democratic new forms of institutions that might be developed that are particularly reflecting the social and political dynamic in Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East, to something quite negative, which might be a more repressive regime, whether it is coming from an intervention by existing regime forces like the military, or from, as you were suggesting, might occur with the Muslim Brotherhood or other kinds of forces that would come in democratically and then may end up having a very different agenda from what the public at large would like to see. So those are big questions. We don't know what will be emerging. Is there an analogy in any way between the region and the European Union as a framework for integration and transition and the situation in the Middle East? The answer is simply, I think, not. Much as I suggested, and there are some columnists in the press who are now also suggesting that the Marshall Plan might be a good framework within which to think of assistance flowing from Europe and the United States to the region. It's not the same as the kind of political pull of membership in the European Union, which obviously had a significant effect here. As to Rodrigo, your question, yes, there's no question in my mind that it would be better essentially to let the situation unfold without intervention in any formal way. But I can tell you as an analyst that there are so many interests at stake in the region. And I speak not just as an American, but in this respect reflecting European opinion as well, and the opinion elsewhere in the world, including the issues of energy, including certainly the situation with respect to Israel, that I think it's unlikely that the US and Europe will be completely hands-off and just simply watch events unfold. That said, I think the only real question they have, the only challenge they face, is the very large one of how and how fast to back regime change that is occurring on the ground, that is occurring not as a result of some intervention, if you will. Worst case scenario was Iraq, of course, but rather occurring because of internal democratic forces that are at work there. How quickly to recognize those forces and how quickly to essentially applaud them, those are the questions that both the EU and the US face. And as I said, I think the ambiguity of their positions is reflected in how hard those questions are to answer, because they don't want to either have an unstable transition which results in perhaps a worse outcome, nor do they want to be seen to be on the wrong side of history.
Thank you. Briefly,
Just briefly. So, of course, the world economy typically, after it slowed down after the 1970s, it slowed down typically after what I may call Middle Eastern geopolitical shock. So whether you take Yom Kippur War, Iranian Revolution, Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, after that always came short recession or stagflation or things like that. So that's maybe in the support of what Rector says, that there are interests of the West, or how to say, in this. And what concerns the young lady who doesn't believe in the data, I would say so there is a lot of. I fully share because that's how I felt in '86, that all Czechoslovak data or Russian data are false. It's actually almost impossible to do. You are absolutely correct. It is government who prepares the data. But there are so many mechanisms in the data which are kind of checking. So while there is a manipulation in the data, definitely I believe in data. Let me put it this way, even Egyptian.
You just destroyed the whole social science field at CEU.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm afraid that, despite the fact that I'm sure there are plenty more questions, we need to bring these to a close. So let me thank everybody in the panel and the audience for a very lively discussion.